All right, America, so you've obtained all of this huge swath of Southwest. You settled Texas territorial dispute. You obtained California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, you name it. You have this huge swath of land. You also previously had settled the Oregon territorial dispute with Britain. Now what? You have achieved your goal of moving from coast to coast. They're still not done yet. That being said, what do you do with all this new territory? The question again rears its ugly head. What do we do about slavery in these new territories? Should these new territories be admitted as free states or as slave states? Many different people back east had been against expansion in the first place, especially New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians, because, well, the more people that live outside those states, the less power they wield. Okay? So they're obviously concerned about expansion, but, well, that's a little bit beside the point now because you've already expanded. But they could still possibly wield their influence by having these new territories as they become states and apply for statehood. You could flex your political muscles by having them be admitted as free states. Southern states see an opportunity to create more slave states. Okay, you can expand your influence. Maybe perhaps farmers out south are looking for new territories and they want to be able to take their slaves with them. They also want to be able to flex their muscles and say, hey, you Yankees up north, you can't tell us what to do. We have a right to our way of life. We have a right to our economic prosperity. So you have various different sectional debates that go on at this point because of all this new territory that had been obtained by the United States. Texas, when it was admitted to the United States in 1845, was admitted as a slave state, largely because American settlers who had settled in what was then a Mexican state brought many of their slaves with them. Even though Mexico didn't adhere to slavery and didn't have organized slavery in their country, they did little about it. So slavery had already been established in what is present day Texas, most specifically in East Texas. And if you look geographically, East Texas it's a pine forest. It's really one of the major regions of Texas that is kind of distinct from all the others. It's a pine forest, and it's an extension basically of the Old South. Okay, so that's where you have more of your more intense Southern culture there in East Texas. Um, Otherwise, though, what do we do about slavery in these territories? So you have various different politicians that try and introduce legislation that could perhaps maybe eliminate slavery in these new territories. Okay, um, any territory acquired by Mexico or from Mexico cannot have slavery in it. That was actually a provision, the Wilmot Proviso. Um, it failed in Congress, but that was a discussion in and amongst people discussing through their sectional debate, what do we do with the question of slavery with this vast amount of territory that we have obtained and annexed? Okay. So in 1820, there was that Missouri Compromise, which basically admitted Missouri as a slave state, so long as no other states north of that parallel would be admitted as a slave state. That was something that held off some of these slave discussions at that time. For the better part of 30 years, nobody really wanted to talk about the slave question. Well, now we've just gained this gigantic swath of land, essentially the next one third of the continental United States. Okay? You've got to do something about that. Then there was also a philosophy of popular sovereignty. And what I mean by that is the idea that maybe the states themselves can decide, based upon settlers who settle in there, or perhaps even people who are already there, they can vote amongst themselves as to whether or not they want to be admitted as a slave state or a free state. Okay? Generally, um, those debates dragged on for months. In the late 1840s, as a result of territory having been gained by the Americans as a result of the war. So, an election in 1848 would now have to happen. And, of course, this whole conversation kind of dampened the entire election. The Democrats nominated somebody from Michigan who was kind of lackluster and unexciting. The Whig Party nominated General Zachary Taylor, a Mexican American war hero. What is it with war heroes in America? We seem to sure love them. George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor, you name it. Eisenhower, we'll talk about that in 1302. Otherwise, though, Zachary Taylor was a hero of the Mexican War and obtained the Whig nomination. And the knock against him was that he had no political experience. Well, yeah, you're right. Martin Van Buren had become an anti slavery Democrat, had become disenfranchised with the Democratic Party, who still espoused the idea of slavery, established his own new party, the Free Soil Party. In other words, free soil. Should a new territory be admitted as a state, it should be a free state. That was the basic platform of the Free Soil Party. So, even though the Free Soil Party didn't wield much power nationally altogether, their message was clear. There was a clear abolitionist movement that is trying to influence and stop the spread of slavery. Okay? So hold that thought for 1 second because California now has a question. See, California is this vast, long state along the Pacific coast. Gosh, the weather's beautiful in Southern California. I spent about the better part of a week down in San Diego there last summer. It's fantastic. I certainly understand why people like the weather there. Um, there was a rancher and a farmer up in Northern California on the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains um, who had a sawmill up there. And it was discovered that there were traces of gold in those foothills of the Sierra Nevada near his mill. And as news got out in 1848, it created this buzz all across the nation and then reached elsewhere across the world that there's gold in Northern California. Hundreds of thousands of people would make their way to Northern California over the course of the next couple of years in search of gold. So, what that did was it created a gold rush that largely centered in the year 1849. And as it was in Northern California, the people who came in 1849 in search of gold in and around Sutter's Mill and in the other areas of the foothills became known as 49ers, people prospecting for gold in Northern California. And yes, if you're wondering where the San Francisco 49ers get their namesake, it's referring to the gold rush, hence the gold in red colors of the San Francisco 49ers. Okay? Sutter's Mill was located not that far from modern day Sacramento, between there and Reno, Nevada. It's still Northern California as it was. Okay? So the San Francisco 49ers get their name from the 1849 gold rush around Sutter's Mill. Okay? Which, little side note, do a little research about how major professional sports teams get their namesakes. You'll be interested. It's really really cool. You can figure to guess how the Dallas Cowboys got their name. And Texas, an iconic cowboy culture throughout our history. You'd kind of figure, okay, makes sense. Um, where do the other sports franchises get their names? And if you kind of notice, the Dallas area teams have kind of a theme: the Rangers, Mavericks, Cowboys. All right. there's a little bit of a theme there. So off that side note, um, people would come to Northern California, 49ers as they were, prospectors, are often depicted. If you've ever seen depictions of prospectors in historical publications, they all seem like old men with beards, and they have this weird "I'm going to find the gold" type accent. It's like what is this? Their depictions of prospectors are always just kind of over the top, it seems. Otherwise, though, 95% of all of the 49ers coming to California to help look for gold are men. So you create a weird California society that's absent of white women and children. It's weird. It's almost all dudes looking for gold. Okay? But it didn't just attract white settlers, it attracted Chinese settlers. I'm not talking about people from China already in America. I'm talking about actually poor Chinese peasants back in China. Okay? Many of these poor Chinese peasants got word that there was gold in the foothills of Sierra Nevada in California and wanted to maybe find a better way for themselves. Maybe they could find enough gold to where they can um, make do and eventually come back to China with an improved lot in life. Okay? Problem is, if you're dirt poor, you got to find a way to pay for it. So many of these Chinese peasants found a way working with immigrant brokers to maybe pay for their passage, and upon return, they would use some of their gold to pay for their passage and otherwise their labor. Okay? Um, of course, you have immigration that would now become an issue. You had a swell of Chinese nationals coming to Northern California. You have a swell of other Americans coming to California. Many of the Native Americans at the time who still lived in Northern California were often encouraged to work as laborers in the gold movement. What does that mean? I think you know what that means. Okay. Um, Otherwise, though, important to California itself wasn't just that there was gold there. There was now a mass of people coming to California, which had been admitted as a state just after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. Okay? The state population of California began to swell. So much so that in 1848, San Francisco's population was about 1,000 people. Within a few years, the next decade or so, the population of San Francisco swelled to over 50,000 people. That's just an idea of the type of population growth that you would see in Northern California as a result of this 49er gold rush. Okay? So, you have mostly males coming in search of gold. They came from China. They came from elsewhere in the United States. That's the majority of them. You had some Europeans, some South Americans. You had some Mexicans. Um, they would all accompany each other in search of gold. The majority of them didn't find anything, if much at all. Okay, some of them did, and some of them became pretty wealthy. The majority of folks didn't find anything. Okay, and if they did, maybe it was a few specks here and there that they squandered, and that was it. But the gold rush helped to swell populations in Northern California so much that even people who didn't find anything decided to try and make a way in agricultural or mining industries. Okay, so they did find, especially the Central Valley of California, to be especially fruitful for agriculture. So they at least had that opportunity. But going back to the slavery question, okay? Um, President Taylor had asked Congress to admit California as a free state. Okay. Well, what else do you do about some of these other states and other territories? Um, the government would become responsible for admitting states under each prosperity, whether slave state or free state. Once they became states, maybe, well, the government really had the authority to admit the state, but they really wanted to leverage the decision to each state. But with so much conversation, Congress would really balk at that. Gosh, people seem to really want to avoid the slavery question that has gone back since our revolutionary days. So you have other different things going on because Southerners were concerned about fugitives leaving slave states, making their way to free states, and therefore obtaining their freedom illegally in the eyes of the slaveholder. You have abolitionists who feared the expansion of slavery into new different territories. Okay. Um, the Southerners felt that if there were more territories out north and out west that were admitted as free states, they would lose their grip on more political power and they would eventually be forced out of their way of life. So Southerners feared expansion of free states. Something's going to have to come to a head because you have differing economic ideologies, differing ideas about slavery, and the economies of which are both quite important. Slave states have a slave culture, that peculiar institution, that has a massive effect on agricultural output. And slave states, like those you see in the Deep South, have pretty much all their eggs in one cotton-laced basket. Without cheap slave labor, you threaten the entire economic output of the South. Therefore, you threaten the Southern way of life. So they will defend that peculiar institution to the death if necessary. You have an impending conflict that's very likely going to take place. And it's all these new territories that are popping up out west that are forcing the issue. You're either going to have slavery or you're not going to have slavery, and some people are adamant about their position. Something is eventually going to have to happen. Well, you have various other different things that happen in the late 1840s, and in early 1850, President Taylor suddenly died. Okay, it's not the first time an American president has died while in office. It won't be the last. Okay, we'll talk about that as we talk about in 1302, the decade of the 1960s. Otherwise, though, Vice President Millard Fillmore becomes President of the United States. Okay. Fillmore understood the idea of flexibility and compromise. And he persuaded many different politicians from various different viewpoints to do just the same. And he supported an omnibus bill that was really 5 different parts that would at least help settle some of the questions in and about slavery as pertaining to new states. And this bill was dubbed the Compromise of 1850. It is one of the lesser known aspects of American history, but it had an amazing impact in the greater scheme. And most people don't even know about it. And we'll talk in the next chapter why the Compromise of 1850 is so important. What the actual Compromise of 1850 did was it listed the idea that, okay, new states are going to be admitted as free states. But to placate Southern fears, they would enact a fugitive slave trade law. Okay, a fugitive slave law, to where if a slave escapes from a slave state into a free state, by federal law, that free state is to allow extradition back to its owner in a slave state. Okay? So no new slave states, but at least fugitives are going to be brought back. Other aspects of the Compromise of 1850 was that it recognized Texas in its old independent republic boundary, the Rio Grande, remember that whole thing? The Rio Grande basically bisects New Mexico. And again, I said New Mexicans saw Texan independence. They're like, "We're what? We're part of Texas? What? We're no, we're a different colony." They were geographically a part of Texas. The Compromise of 1850, as a question of New Mexico statehood, perhaps, split Texas into its modern boundary. As I had mentioned, Texas used to go up all the way in a little sliver all the way up to Wyoming and basically follow the Rio Grande, half of New Mexico, up into Colorado and up that sliver to New Mexico, including parts of western Kansas and the panhandle of Oklahoma, by the way. Okay? The Compromise of 1850 said, hey, Texas, we're going to split you up. We're going to section off portions of your state. And they basically set the modern boundary for what is present day and current Texas. And they did so under the idea that, hey, look, Texas, we're going to cut you up, but the United States government will assume all of your debt that you incurred in your republic days. Okay? So you will be debt-free Texas as long as you will agree to split us up, let you split up. And Texas did. Okay? The Compromise of 1850 was very important because the United States, from a sectional standpoint, was definitely going to come to blows. Something was going to happen. You're not going to have different cultural, economic, and other output power struggles happen without something coming to blows. And eventually things do come to blows. They just don't come to blows in the 1850s. Something was going to happen. Eventually, the slave question would be dealt. Something would be done about it. The Compromise of 1850 bought about a decade's worth of time for there to be further discussion. We're going to talk about that soon.